At 0900 hours, Mountain Standard. A report quietly published by the New York Times contained a single sentence that stopped American military planners cold. The United States Air Force had placed its B-2 stealth bomber fleet at abnormally high alert status, not elevated, not heightened, abnormally high. Words chosen deliberately by reporters who understood that abnormally high readiness at Whiteman Air Force Base in Knob Noster, Missouri meant one thing. In operational context defined by carriers entering the Arabian Sea, Geneva talks failing to produce agreement, and satellite imagery from February 10th, showing something at Pickax Mountain that intelligence analysts described using vocabulary reserved for facilities designed to survive. Exactly. The weapons sitting on those bombers, waiting for orders that had not yet arrived, but that positioning suggested were being seriously considered by people with the authority to give them. The satellite imagery itself was captured by Planet Labs PBC on February 10th and analyzed within 48 hours by the Institute for Science and International Security, a Washington-based nuclear nonproliferation think tank that tracked Iran's atomic program through open-source intelligence and imagery analysis that former intelligence officials consistently described as among the best available outside classified channels. What those images showed at Mount Kanga's Law, known universally as Pickax Mountain, was activity that removed any remaining ambiguity about what Iran was building, 2 kilometers south of the Natanz nuclear complex that American B-2 bombers had destroyed 7 months earlier. Fresh concrete was being poured over the western tunnel entrance using a boom pump, visible in imagery as unmistakable industrial equipment that civilian construction workers operating in a remote mountain location could not explain through any purpose unrelated to hardening an underground facility against penetrating weapons that the American military possessed and had already demonstrated a willingness to use. At the eastern tunnel entrance, rock and soil had been pushed back and leveled above the tunnel portal in patterns consistent with preparation for additional layering that would add meters of earth above a facility designed to resist strikes that sequential GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators had proven capable of defeating when applied to targets not yet protected by construction now underway around the clock, according to imagery showing dump trucks, cement mixers, backhoes, and truck-mounted cranes operating continuously through days and nights, captured in repeated satellite passes. The concrete-reinforced headwork structure that ISIS analysts identified adjacent to the western entrance was the detail that elevated concern from serious to urgent in assessments circulating through the Pentagon and intelligence community by February 11th. Headworks, in engineering terminology, meant precisely what the word suggested: a structure at the head of a tunnel designed to distribute the load from material placed above by building concrete-reinforced headworks. Iran was explicitly preparing to pile additional rock, soil, or potentially more concrete above tunnel portals in layers that would incrementally increase the depth that any weapon would need to penetrate before reaching whatever was inside. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator that B-2 bombers carried weighed 30,000 lbs. Dropped sequentially, multiple weapons bored through successive layers of rock until the cumulative overpressure from detonations collapsed even the most reinforced underground chambers. At Fordow, 6 MOPs had destroyed a facility buried 60 meters deep inside a mountain 60 miles south of Tehran. The resulting explosion was described by a trailing pilot as the brightest I have ever seen. Literally looks like daylight. Pickax Mountain's new headworks were designed to ensure that whatever depth Fordow had occupied would be exceeded at Kanga's Law by margins that changed the operational calculation from difficult to impossible with existing weapons. The depth problem was the central challenge driving the B-2 alert status that the New York Times had confirmed. Current intelligence estimated the Pickax Mountain facility was being constructed between 90 and 120 meters deep in some areas. Not uniformly, not completely. Construction was ongoing. ISIS analysts noted that heavy machinery presence indicated the facility was not yet operational. But not yet operational was a temporal statement. It described current status, not permanent condition, and the transition from not operational to operational at facility depths that conventional weapons might not reliably destroy was a threshold that, once crossed, could not be reversed without nuclear options that no American official had publicly advocated and that political constraints made effectively unavailable, regardless of what operational necessity might eventually demand. This was the race being run in satellite imagery released to the public while Geneva talks proceeded 100 meters underground in a diplomatic facility where Iranian and American envoys sought an agreement that military preparations suggested neither side was confident would be reached. Iran was hardening facilities against strikes. America was positioning forces and maintaining bomber readiness to conduct strikes before hardening rendered them ineffective. Both tracks operated simultaneously because both sides recognized that the other side was preparing for the scenario where talking failed and shooting began. And preparation itself created momentum toward failure by demonstrating that both sides had concluded failure was probable enough to justify expensive, exhausting, politically risky military readiness that rational actors maintain only when they genuinely believe war is possible within a timeline short enough to warrant the current commitment of resources. Colonel Josh Witala commanded the 509th Bomb Wing at Whiteman. His wing had conducted Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025. 7 B-2 bombers, 14 GBU-57 MOPs, a 37-hour mission covering more than 7,000 miles round trip from Missouri to Iranian airspace. In the months after those strikes, Witala had given carefully worded interviews that conveyed pride without triumphalism. He had called Midnight Hammer one of the most consequential raids executed in his lifetime as an airman. He had praised the crews and maintainers who made flawless execution possible, but he had also noted publicly that the small size of America's B-2 fleet created constraints. 18 operational aircraft from 20 serial production models, 2 having been destroyed in accidents in 2008 and 2022, with 1 more undergoing repair. 18 stealth bombers was not a large force. 7 had been committed to Midnight Hammer. 11 remained available. Not all would be serviceably ready simultaneously, at readiness rates that classified figures captured, but that general principles suggested meant the available force at any given time was a fraction of the total inventory that public counting suggested was adequate, but operational reality constrained further. General Dan Caine, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had issued a warning after Midnight Hammer that intelligence analysts recalled when examining Pickax Mountain imagery. Our adversaries around the world should know that there are other DTRA team members out there studying targets for the same amount of time that we studied Iranian nuclear targets, and will continue to do so. The statement was threat and promise simultaneously. Defense Threat Reduction Agency teams had spent 15 years cataloging Iranian nuclear facilities before Midnight Hammer was executed. They knew depths, materials, access points, vulnerabilities that classified assessments captured and that targeting packages incorporated. Now, those teams were studying Pickax Mountain, recording every truck movement, every concrete pour, every equipment arrival, building an understanding of a facility that would be necessary if the order came to destroy it before it reached a depth that made destruction impossible with weapons available. The Isfahan nuclear complex added a dimension to the satellite imagery story that Pickax Mountain alone could not capture fully. Planet Labs imagery from January 30th, 2026, had shown a new roof constructed over a previously destroyed building at the Isfahan site. The roof had been completed by early January, not for habitation, not for traditional industrial purposes. A roof over a damaged nuclear facility served one operational purpose: concealing reconstruction activity from satellite observation that would otherwise document exactly what was being rebuilt undercover. That imagery could penetrate only if structures were open to the sky. Iran had learned from previous experience that overhead imagery provided intelligence that informed targeting. By covering damaged buildings with new roofs before reconstruction was complete, Tehran could hide progress that outside observers could otherwise track with precision sufficient to update weapons requirement calculations that targeting relied upon. At another location, just south of the Isfahan facility's perimeter, imagery analysts had identified barriers installed at the entrance to an underground complex that the Iranian government had never publicly acknowledged. The barriers were not security measures. They were blast protection, positioned to absorb the initial overpressure from near-miss detonations that might not destroy the facility directly, but that shock effects could damage through indirect transmission. Barrier installation at an unnamed facility south of Isfahan, which IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi had stated just before the June strikes was likely a new enrichment site, suggested Iran was treating it with the same priority as Natanz and Fordow, which had been publicly known and publicly struck. A secret facility receiving secret blast protection, measured in barriers visible to satellites that Iran knew were watching, meant either Iran had accepted that concealment was futile and was focusing on hardening instead, or Iran intended the barriers as a signal to American planners that this facility was defended and that intelligence assessments should factor defensive measures into weapons calculations accordingly. The Parchin military complex introduced a dimension that received less attention than nuclear sites, but that experts considered potentially more significant for the long-term weapons development timeline. Satellite imagery analyzed by ISIS had revealed that Iran had constructed a 150-foot-long chamber at Parchin since the June strikes. The chamber was at a factory that intelligence assessed was used for testing high explosives that could function as triggers for nuclear warheads, not nuclear devices themselves, triggers. The distinction was important, but not reassuring. A nuclear weapon requires fissile material, an implosion design, and a trigger that compresses the fissile core fast enough for a chain reaction to produce nuclear yield before the material disperses. Iran possessed 4,400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that Vice President J.D. Vance had confirmed in June remained in Iranian possession after Midnight Hammer. Strikes had destroyed enrichment infrastructure, but not necessarily material stored elsewhere. Further enrichment from 60% to 90% weapons grade requires a facility, not material. Trigger testing requires a different facility. Weaponization requires a metallurgy facility to produce uranium hexafluoride for enrichment into metal components for device assembly. Parchin had been targeted by Israel in 2024, not by American or Israeli strikes in June 2025. It had not been attacked at all during the Midnight Hammer operation. Now it was fortified with anti-aircraft artillery that Imagery confirmed, suggesting Iran understood American and Israeli planners were aware of its significance and had accepted its omission from June strikes as an error, not policy. The anti-aircraft artillery would not defeat a modern American strike package employing suppression of enemy air defense missions that Midnight Hammer had executed flawlessly, according to General Caine's briefing. But it would force strike packages to adopt tactics that complicated approach geometry, increased standoff ranges, altered timing, and, in aggregate, made operations more complex and therefore more likely to produce results that deviated from planning assumptions that simple attacks achieve more reliably than complex ones. The B-2 bomber's abnormal readiness status represented an operational decision with a specific meaning that the New York Times February 13th report had confirmed through sources at the highest levels of the American military establishment. Readiness status for a nuclear-capable strategic bomber force is not adjusted casually. Maintaining abnormally high readiness consumes resources. It requires keeping aircraft serviced and ready beyond normal standards, requires crew availability at hours that standard scheduling does not demand, requires munitions pre-positioned and configured rather than in storage and disassembled. All of these requirements cost money, exhaust personnel, and wear equipment at rates that peacetime operations do not justify. The decision to accept these costs was a decision made by people who calculated that the probability of operations within a specific timeline exceeded a threshold where the operational benefits of readiness exceeded the costs of maintaining it. That calculation was not public, but the status itself was public through the New York Times report that American officials had apparently chosen not to deny. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator that would be employed in any future strikes had a history that informed understanding of both capability and limitation. Chief Master Sergeant Frank Espinoza and his team had loaded 14 of the 30,000 lb bombs into B-2 bombers before Midnight Hammer. All had functioned as designed, according to General Caine's post-strike assessment. Fordow's underground halls had been seriously damaged. Natanz's facilities had sustained severe destruction. Isfahan had been struck by more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles from an Ohio-class guided missile submarine that remained publicly unidentified. The combined effect had been described by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth as devastating Iran's nuclear program. But devastating was not destroyed, and devastated programs that receive resources and time reconstitute. Months of satellite imagery documented exactly that reconstitution occurring at multiple sites simultaneously, with new construction designed to survive second strikes that the first strikes demonstrated were operationally feasible. For American military planners studying the Pickax Mountain imagery, the specific challenge was timeline intersection. The facility was not operational. ISIS had confirmed that heavy machinery presence indicated construction remained ongoing and that operations had not commenced. But not operational had a duration measured in months, not years, based on construction pace visible in sequential imagery. If the facility reached operational status before a decision was made to strike it, striking it afterward would require weapons that did not yet exist in deployable numbers. The B-21 Raider, the next-generation stealth bomber designed to succeed the B-2, was in development and early production, but not available in numbers sufficient for a sustained campaign. Congressional reports had urged massive expansion of B-21 acquisition based on analysis that the B-2 fleet was inadequate for the challenges that China, Russia, and Iran simultaneously presented. But acquisition plans required years to execute, and years were precisely what the Pickax Mountain construction pace suggested was not available if preventing an operational nuclear facility was the objective that the current military posture was designed to achieve. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, had made a statement in the weeks before the February Geneva talks that added context to the satellite imagery story that technical analysis alone could not provide. He had threatened that Iran could withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty if American pressure continued. North Korea was the only country to have previously withdrawn from the NPT. After withdrawal, North Korea had continued developing a clandestine nuclear weapons program that eventually achieved functional capabilities that deterred military options that would have been considered when the program was nascent, but that became unavailable once nuclear deterrence existed. The implicit message from Garibabadi was that if American pressure prevented Iran from pursuing a nuclear program within the NPT framework, Iran would pursue it outside that framework, with less transparency and fewer constraints than NPT membership imposed. Whether that threat was credible, or whether it was a negotiating tactic designed to extract concessions through fear of an outcome worse than the current situation, depended on an assessment of Iranian strategic culture that analysts disagreed about, while concurring that the uncertainty itself was dangerous when stakes included nuclear proliferation that, once achieved, could not be reversed, regardless of how many B-2 bombers America placed on abnormally high alert status. Today, Tuesday, February 17th, the Geneva talks that would determine whether a diplomatic solution remained possible were proceeding, while B-2 bombers sat at Whiteman on abnormal readiness, and satellite companies continued tasking imaging satellites to pass over construction sites where workers poured concrete around the clock, apparently indifferent to observation that they knew was continuous and accurate. The crews maintaining those bombers at Whiteman understood abstractly what abnormal readiness status meant, but experienced it concretely through schedules that left minimal time for lives outside the base. Technical specialists responsible for keeping aircraft mission capable at rates that exceeded peacetime targets worked extended shifts. Weapons loading crews practiced procedures that had been performed in training thousands of times, but that operational execution demanded at speeds and accuracy levels that muscle memory alone could not guarantee without continuous rehearsal. Pilots maintained currency through sorties that kept skills at peak, while consuming airframe hours that maintenance crews had to account for in calculations about which aircraft would be available for actual missions, if orders came before scheduled maintenance windows that, if delayed, could not be completed without reducing the overall force available when the need materialized. For the scientists and engineers who had designed the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator specifically to destroy facilities exactly like Pickax Mountain, the satellite imagery created technical anxiety that operational briefings addressed without fully resolving. The MOP had been designed when Fordow was the deepest known Iranian nuclear facility, at approximately 60 meters. Sequential detonations of multiple weapons at Fordow during Midnight Hammer had achieved stated objectives according to General Caine's assessment, but design for 60 meters was different from design for 120 meters, which Pickax Mountain was approaching as construction continued. Weapons effects at greater depths depend on variables including rock hardness, fracture patterns, water table proximity, and chamber geometry that could not be assessed with certainty through overhead imagery alone. Ground truth required access that Iran denied, and denying access was itself a signal about what was inside that any rational observer interpreted correctly, even if certainty remained legally unavailable. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency teams that General Caine had referenced in his post-Midnight Hammer briefing were studying these questions continuously. 15 years of analysis had preceded Midnight Hammer execution. Months of analysis since had updated understanding of what Midnight Hammer achieved and what it had not achieved, and what follow-on operations would need to accomplish differently to achieve objectives that the first operations had not fully realized. That analysis was classified. Its conclusions were not public, but the B-2 alert status that the New York Times had confirmed, the carrier deployments that satellite imagery tracked, and the Geneva talks that both sides acknowledged were the final diplomatic opportunity, all pointed toward the same conclusion about what the classified analysis had produced. It had concluded that the military option remained viable only within a limited window before construction at Pickax Mountain eliminated viability by achieving a depth that conventional weapons could not reliably reach. The window was closing. The pace was measurable, the timeline was calculable, and the calculated timeline was what had driven alert status from normal to abnormal at a facility that only made operational sense if use was being actively planned, rather than theoretically maintained as a deterrent that cost nothing additional to preserve. The economic dimension of B-2 readiness that public discussion rarely engaged with revealed constraints that political statements obscured. Each B-2 Spirit cost approximately $2.2 billion when the program was completed in 1997. The modern equivalent cost would be substantially higher, given inflation and capability improvements that upgrades had incorporated. Operating costs exceeded $170,000 per flight hour for a combination of fuel, maintenance, parts, and personnel that each sortie required. Maintaining 18 aircraft at abnormal readiness while conducting training sorties that sustained crew currency meant daily costs measured in millions that the defense budget absorbed, but that opportunity cost analysis revealed were being paid by reducing funding available elsewhere, including for B-21 Raider procurement that Air Force leaders had stated was urgently needed to replace the B-2 fleet, which age and the small numbers made increasingly inadequate for challenges that simultaneous requirements from Iranian, North Korean, Chinese, and Russian scenarios created faster than acquisition programs could respond. The Iran Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, implications that Deputy Foreign Minister Gharibabadi had raised about potential withdrawal, deserved analysis that news coverage had provided incompletely. NPT membership imposes obligations, including IAEA safeguards, that require Iran to declare nuclear activities and allow inspections. Iran had repeatedly violated these obligations. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi had been demanding explanations for 440 kilos of highly enriched uranium that Iran possessed but could not account for through declared production. The missing material was not a small accounting discrepancy. It was potential multiple nuclear weapons, if further enriched to weapons grade, and weaponized through processes that the Parchin facility had apparently been rehearsing through high-explosive trigger tests that satellite imagery documented. If Iran withdrew from the NPT as Garbabadi threatened, even these inadequate IAEA oversight mechanisms would disappear. Iran would become North Korea, a state pursuing nuclear weapons openly without international legal constraints, accepting the costs of isolation in exchange for a deterrent that elimination required nuclear options. America was not prepared to employ them. The IRGC's decision to conduct live-fire drills in the Strait of Hormuz on Monday, February 16th, while Aragchi flew to Geneva, and while satellite imagery of Pickax Mountain circulated through planning staffs, was communication that required no interpreter. Iran was demonstrating that military pressure would be matched by Iranian demonstrations that the costs of conflict were not one-sided. American carriers approaching the Arabian Sea represented one threat. Iranian missiles, ready to be fired from coastal batteries and mobile launchers, represented a parallel threat that mathematical analysis suggested could overwhelm defensive systems through saturation, regardless of how advanced those systems were. The dual track of diplomatic engagement and military preparation was not a contradiction. It was an integrated strategy where each track reinforced the other, demonstrating military capability, made diplomatic concessions appear to come from a position of strength rather than weakness, and negotiating diplomatically while building fortified facilities that would eventually provide nuclear deterrence preserved the option to resume the program after an agreement expired or collapsed. For the global non-proliferation architecture that had constrained nuclear weapons spread for decades, the outcome of the Iranian nuclear crisis carried implications extending far beyond the Middle East region where the immediate conflict would occur. Saudi Arabia had stated publicly that if Iran achieved nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would pursue nuclear weapons too. The kingdom's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, had said explicitly in an interview that Saudi Arabia would develop a nuclear bomb if Iran developed one. This was not rhetorical flourish. Saudi Arabia had the resources, technical capacity through partnerships, and strategic incentive to match Iranian capability if deterrence required it. Turkish officials had made similar statements in more guarded terms. The Egyptian military had a strategic culture that valued technological parity with regional adversaries. Gulf states, collectively controlling the world's largest hydrocarbon reserves, possessed the financial capacity to acquire nuclear technology through multiple pathways, if strategic calculation demanded it. The nuclear domino effect that regional proliferation would create would transform global security architecture in ways that American strategic planning assumed, but had not fully incorporated into policy frameworks that still treated preventing Iranian nuclear weapons as an isolated objective, rather than as a preventive action against a cascade that successful Iranian weaponization would trigger. Each additional nuclear state increased the probability of nuclear use through accident, miscalculation, or deliberate choice that rational deterrence theory assumed would be prevented by consequences that both sides understood, but that history demonstrated were not always sufficient to prevent leaders from choices that logic should have prevented, but that psychology, nationalism, religiosity, and desperation sometimes overrode, regardless of what rational models predicted. The satellite imagery from February 10th that ISIS had analyzed and published on February 13th, showing concrete being poured at Pickax Mountain, was therefore not just technical documentation of construction activity at a single facility. It was evidence that the race between facility completion and military action was entering its final phase, where outcomes would be determined in days and weeks, not months and years. B-2 bombers on abnormal readiness at Whiteman were not a political statement. They were an operational reality that maintenance schedules and crew assignments and weapons configurations reflected in ways that deliberate preparation for use looked different from deterrence maintained at standard readiness that cost less and signaled less. Both sides understood the difference. Both sides were acting on that understanding simultaneously. And simultaneously meant that the window in which diplomacy could alter the trajectory was measured in remaining construction days at Pickax Mountain that satellites would document, and analysts would assess, and planners would update, and calculations that would determine whether talks in Geneva produced an agreement that justified standing down a readiness that every day closer to an operational facility argued against reducing, until an agreement was verified and construction halted and IAEA inspectors confirmed that the race had ended through diplomacy, rather than through the action that ending by force would require. And that force, once employed, would produce consequences extending far beyond the technical success that bombing achieved and the political failure that the region absorbed for a generation, regardless of whether bombs found their targets and targets ceased to exist, because the existence of targets was not the only consequence that mattered when consequences included everything that came after the last bomb fell. The last crater was photographed by the same satellites that had documented the construction those bombs were sent to prevent from reaching completion, which deterrence through diplomacy had failed to stop.